Stan, it's a pleasure as always.
The pleasure is mine.
It's great to be here in the great room. You know, I love the acoustics of the space. It's been fun to do a couple records here over the years and, hear your piano recordings in this room. Maybe we can start there. Tell everyone about your big room.
Very well. This was part of a design that was available to us when we were thinking about building this house, and we went to the person who was going to be constructing it, and he said, "What can we help you with?" And Dixie and I told him that we were interested in something where we could have more than 2 people for dinner. We'd always lived in small houses. And the salesman said, "You need the balance." And I said, "What's a balance?" He says, "That's our party house." So here we are with a vaulted ceiling, 16 foot from the floor at one end and about 12 at the other. So it cuts down tremendously on the echoes. So that's part of the secret to success. But even if we were to clap our hands or make some abrupt sound, we'd notice there's almost no echo at all. You can just tell you're in a big room. So we're very pleased with that.
Yeah, the best way I could describe it is it's very diffuse, but it's very controlled as well. It's almost like if you put one mic out in the room, like a Blumlein pair, I've done this before here, it's always just a nice natural capture. It's almost a perfect blend of ambience. And in this case, I'll talk a little bit about what we recorded today. So we recorded 2 things today. The first is your beautiful player piano here, which we'll talk a little bit about. We did a recording of, not a roll. Usually we do, a roll of, what do you call it? The piano rolls?
Yes.
Usually we do that, but in this case, I just played a little something on it. We did some video for that. We did some audio recordings and DSD with the new Locomotive Audio octal tube preamps.
Impressive.
Using some beautiful AEA R44CX microphones. Those are my favorites. And then for the rooms, we used a R88 Mark II out in the room to kind of mic the ambience, and that went through the good old Fern, which is my personal standard usually. But man, I'll tell you, on the piano recordings alone, you actually did a direct recording to your setup. Now tell us a little bit about your setup you usually use for recording the piano here.
I use Pro Tools on a Mac, and today we were using 2 electric condenser mics that are between the piano and the wall behind it. So it minimizes any interference from out on this side and makes it, and it reduces the echo even more. So it gives me a tremendous, it's delicate. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it sounds delicate to me. It's very, very precise.
Well, it's amazing. You have a piano like this with older strings. It's a very mellow sound. I always notice with the condenser microphone recordings, it's very, you can pinpoint every little detail in a nice way. But I like the recordings you get. It's not like, what do you call it, brassy, like I've heard some recordings done that way sound. It's very nice. And I thought it was an interesting comparison once we brought these mics kind of out in front of the piano, and it was really emulating more of you're in the room with the instrument now.
Because you could hear a slight echo, exactly what happened.
But let me ask you, Stan, I'm curious what your opinion was of somewhat this setup with the DSD, having the mic somewhat out a little bit. I personally felt that there was a clarity still, that it had the warmth and everything, but there was still a clarity to all those notes. I was curious what you thought of the sound.
Indeed, I agree with that. And also that these newer versions of the old RCA 44BX, this has a slightly more sensitive upper end, I think I'd describe it. So it would work even better nowadays for a vocal mic in a new studio, for example.
Well, I hear the story from Wes a lot, but I believe it's the Lord of the Rings soundtrack. I think 1, 2, and 3, if I'm correct. Wes developed the CX44 AEA mics for that purpose, to be almost a hot rod, right? Where it was just a punchy in the face with sound kind of thing. And I wouldn't describe the 44 as a punchy in the face, but you can put a source in front of that and it's going to hit you. It's very intimate.
Indeed.
But it is interesting on more delicate instruments like this, the ability to kind of capture that nuance, even from a distance.
Yes. They are they're fascinating to me. A ribbon has always fascinated me as a transducer for something like this. And the original ones were strictly just a vibrating ribbon, nothing more. And if you put in a preamp, why, that changes everything anyway. So I liked it the way it was naturally, still do.
Yeah. Well, and it's always interesting too, because, we see the development of recording technology, and as stuff progresses, the standard though is still, how does something sound acoustically in the environment, right?
Yes.
And so for me, it's like the reason I always end up back with, the ribbon mics and, primarily the vacuum tube gear is because for me, I can put that up and it sounds like the music. It sounds like being in the room.
Exactly.
And it was interesting when I first started working, you work in PCM like most people do. Here with Big Ribbon Stories, we're big proprietors of, the DSD format. But it's interesting when I first started working with that, it's almost like I could play something, record it, and hear it back, and it's like all that air was still there. I didn't hear any darkness that people associate with these mics. It's like something was just so open. And especially in a room like this where the frequencies are so controlled. Stan, you've heard a handful of DSD recordings that, I've done, some here in your room, some in different spaces, some churches, some recording studios. I'm curious your overall impression of, this way of working, i.e. ribbon mics, primarily the vacuum tube gear and the DSD format. I'm curious what you hear as a big picture. So when you put on like the Heaven to Me record, for example, the kind of bombastic stereo record, I'm curious what you thought of the general tonal qualities of recording.
Of these particular mics here?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, these seem to be more equal in their frequency response than the old 44s of mine that you used. And that was one of the reasons that we especially made sure that when you use the old RCA versions, that we had it set to its music position to be sure and pick up the low end.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's objectionable, especially if it's a deep voice announcer.
Yeah.
But these and mine sound very nice, and these have a little bit more top end.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the last recording that we did here was actually very similar to the piano recording we did today. We actually did a piano roll recording with your 44s. And I remember we did that with, I think, the merging system and the Fern. So it's interesting. I've heard kind of the two perspectives of, a similar chain to a degree, but it always just baffles me, like, the intimacy, but you still get the space of the room all at the same time. It's like, it really is just intriguing to me because I come here and listen acoustically to these great piano rolls and just like, wow, what a sound, right?
Indeed. Now, the way this one's configured, it's bidirectional, so you and I might sound a little bit like we're in stereo if we had a pair up here, or if we were feeding two channels from two different of these 44s. But here it's strictly mono. But another thing, we don't get quite as much, I bet, we don't get quite as much room echo this way, because the way this mic is oriented, being bidirectional, it's not going to pick up the length of the room. That's what I would say in advance without hearing it.
Yeah, it's, I love figure eight. I use it to my advantage quite a bit. A lot of people fight that way of working, but for me, I struggle with like cardioid in particular. It's hard for me to make cardioid work.
In what way?
It's usually the way the off-axis response sound is. So if I am multi-micing a source, or if I'm doing like acoustic guitar and vocal, I find with it's not even a condenser thing necessarily. It's just the way most of those mics pick up in that pattern. It's hard for me to get that to work. It's the standard, but for me, I can always kind of make a figure eight mic work. I can use the nulls to my advantage.
Okay.
Like we did a recording as well where we did acoustic guitar and vocal. We recorded the song By the Time I Get to Phoenix, and we did that really simply. It's just the pair of 44s, the R88 in the room. But it's so fascinating to me. I've done this so many times, but I put the acoustic guitar 44 like this to where the null's facing my mouth, and it's just pointed at the guitar, and then the vocal mic, the null of that mic's pointed at the guitar. You put them right next to each other. It's kind of like the side of a triangle. And you know what's always crazy to me? The phase is pretty much perfect, and there's almost no bleed in the respective mics. So my vocal mic's vocal mic. Try doing that with cardioid. I can't make that work the same way.
That's interesting.
So, or even just think Blumline. I mean, Blumline is just two figure eight microphones like this, right?
Yes.
Gosh, we could talk about that for hours.
Yes.
The stuff that Alan Blumline did.
Extra depth and dimension.
Yeah.
With that. Yeah, I'm so glad that he was able to show us that it was possible to do before he had his last airplane ride.
Yeah. It's almost it's amazing to think what could have been if there was another 20 to 30 years of
Yes.
development from him. Stan, did you have any particular questions for me for these sessions? I'm curious.
As a matter of fact, yes, I'd appreciate hearing more about this vacuum tube powered amplifier you brought with you today.
Right. So I know I was talking your head off about this. This is the Locomotive Audio 40AM2. This is their new offering. It's an octal tube-based mic pre. This was the first time I really got to use it on what I'd call melodic instruments. So, like vocals, acoustic guitar, acoustic piano. And man, I mean, it's based on older vacuum tube designs that were primarily used with these 44 mics in the 30s and 40s. And it really gets that sound. It was like immediately I was just like, there's the sound of, the best of the 40s and the 50s. And I was blown away by it. It had this certain intimacy to the character of the sound that was just different than anything I've heard in my arsenal. I use a lot of different tube offerings and some solid state stuff too, but this was a unique piece. I thought it sounded just really, really open, really intimate. It's interesting. It has a couple different settings here. You have your actual gain knob, which is really just, okay, this is your volume, you set it, but it does change as you set it differently. But one thing he's implemented here is the response knob. I'm just kind of getting you to know it. I've used this box on two things now. What we did today, and then we did another session last week, which we'll be talking about more in a future video. But man, last week this was on the kick drum and the bass DI. And it's interesting, I put that mix up on the console just to listen to it. It's the most thunderous low end. I had 44s on both I had a 44 on the kick drum mic, and then the DI was the DI, but the amp was a 44. And I think it was either the amp or the DI going through this. But either way, it was thunder. I was just blown away.
Terrific.
And then the response knob here, kind of getting back to that, it kind of tailors the frequency response, and I think I don't know what else it messes with, but it was just a really interesting box. I'm just kind of getting to know it a little bit.
Yes.
But
And you finally get to use something with an octal tube base.
yeah, I haven't had an opportunity to use much designs with that.
I grew up with them.
That would be an interesting point. Tell me a little bit about those preamps, growing up with those.
Everything was heavy. Most of these kinds of apparatus had exterior power supplies, and the ones that had the power supply built in with the chokes and the transformer and so forth, something like that would have weighed about 80 pounds.
Ugh.
And the solid state, well, everybody knows about the solid state, but
Yeah.
those things were big and warm, and in the winter it was nice to have 2 or 3 of them on in wherever you were working. Didn't have to run an external heater.
Mm-hmm. I've definitely seen some of those old designs, and some of those transformers alone are just like this big. It's crazy. But hey, a lot of them sound remarkable. A lot of that gear is just,
Yes.
when it's maintained well, and
If you've seen a photograph of an old, say, 1930s AM broadcast station, say a 50,000 watt station, there's a separate room for all of that. And some of those transformers are 12 feet tall, and they have people standing beside and looking up at them. Massive. And
Amazing.
they were water cooled. They had like a small swimming pool outside. They called it the cooling pond. And they would circulate the cool water through the apparatus, not getting on the electrical parts, of course, of those transformers and vacuum tubes for the final output power. And it made a difference. It kept them cool.
yeah.
Not literally cool,
Yeah.
just cooler.
Yeah. It's amazing. I love these stories. There's always so many every time we talk. It's just, it's a good hang, I'm curious, as you see a next generation of recording engineers kind of coming out of the weeds, as it were, you started the Coutant.org website, which, for folks who are really interested in these microphones and just a knowledge base of a lot of this, we'll say in parentheses, vintage gear, but hey, I call it gear. Some people call it vintage gear.
It's all right.
But I'm curious, like, if you were to see or pass on some information, or if you'd want something to be remembered with the Coutant.org website, like, what would you want to be passed down the most?
Philosophically, or just any way I want to answer it?
Any way you want to answer.
Okay. Well, the idea came to me in year 2000 3 years before I retired. And it was one of my advanced students who said, in the textbook and in the syllabus, we don't have anything about the old RCA ribbon mics. Could you find me something on that? I'd like to have it to keep. And I said, sure. And by the time 2019 rolled around, after my retirement, that what originally began as a 1 or 2 page handout has grown to over 1,000 pages.
Wow.
And is quite popular. And the one thing that has impressed me is that the inquiries that come from people who visit that site, several of them have been university physics professors. And they're contacting me to ask permission to use part of the mic site in this physics book they're writing, and they in their section on transducers. They want to use the inner working photographs of the ribbon mics and the way things were, because there's not too much of this stuff left. And these, I think they're a good place to start, because you can see what's inside and begin to realize exactly how they work. Because you look in a pencil electric condenser microphone now and you don't see very much, but you sure can with these.
Stan, I'm curious your perspectives on how fidelity has changed throughout the decades. So not necessarily, we'll call it timestamps of a certain sound of a decade, but more so of, okay, how has the art of recording and sonics changed from your perspective? Let's say starting with 78s and shellac all the way up to the modern, DSD workstation.
Happy to accommodate that. That's easy. The 78 RPM records that were popular in the 30s and 40s lacked fidelity. You were lucky to get mid-range, surface noise, and of course such shellac records were very fragile. And they were short. Only had 3 minutes, I think, maybe 4, been too long. So when vinyl records came into being, and especially microgroove, the fidelity was greatly increased, full range. I didn't think about measuring the frequency response because, hey, it sounded so good. I didn't even care about it numerically, but it really began to sound live. And that was the exciting part. Vinyl was stronger, the microgroove, and especially when it became the stereo option, it really increased the fidelity, the reality, the enjoyment of it all. And then in 1981, when Sony and Philips developed the CD, that was another milestone. They developed it, they did not invent it. And the frequency response, the fidelity increased even more, because with digital recordings, we didn't have the problem with tape hiss. A lot of people said that the records sounded better, the vinyl sounded better than the digital recordings. And some people disagreed. I didn't have a problem with it. They both sounded good to me. But when you consider the tape hiss on, say, an Ampex tape transport, the tape hiss started about 60 dB down. So if you were doing a symphony orchestra, the dynamic range of a symphony orchestra, say 80 members in number, it's close to 80 dB of dynamic range. And that's why they had to use compression to bring the bass up out of the tape hiss. But once we went to digital, I remember Ray Dolby was amazed, and he was one of the first people who impressed me with how excited he was that now you had the full range of a symphony orchestra dynamic range, and it just sounded great. So yes, the CDs did a lot, or digital recording did a lot to improve frequency response, reduction of tape hiss and background noise and all of that. And then along came the digital mixing consoles were certainly a big, what do I want to say? Another milestone, I suppose, would be a way to put it, because now you didn't have the problem with some of the noise that was in some of the earlier, even the solid state mixing consoles for studio recordings, multi-track, did have some noise. But once you got into the solid state, 96 channel mixing consoles, they were wonderful, big, expensive, and I was amazed the first time I saw one. I said, how many operators are you going to get to run this? How many engineers? And that was never a problem.
It was interesting, even kind of going back to the idea of recording and capturing an orchestra. I recently captured a performance that you were at, and it was really interesting. I feel like digital audio really has come full circle to where now the quality of sound that we were getting with analog, it's a debate, right? A lot of people still argue, myself included, that a lot of these vinyl records sounded better than the CDs. And I'd argue that a lot of it's implementation. And the other side of it was just, the limitations of early digital audio. The filters involved, the idea of sampling. And yeah, there's amazing ways to make 44.1 sound good.
Yes, yes.
But that's the point. It's good. Is it best? And so it's interesting.
Hard question to answer.
Yeah. We're getting into that whole thing.
I'll go back to Ray Dolby for one more second.
Yeah.
I wondered what his reaction was going to be because of the Dolby sound reduction, or noise reduction, I'm sorry, and motion picture soundtracks and all of that. He didn't seem to mind. He was so impressed with the increase in dynamic range.
And it's the perspective thing. I think that's a great point to make is, a lot of people get fixated on a specific thing or an aspect, but sometimes it's I don't have to deal with hiss anymore. And it's great because now I can make, I recently recorded an orchestra and you were at this performance and I had so much dynamic range, but I also had the timbre characteristics of the analog signal. So it's just amazing to me, kind of where we've ended up in recording of what can we reproduce? What is the quality of sound that we can get? Can we be there in that room?
Oh, you just used the phrase where we have ended up. It's not going to stop where we are today.
Very good point.
It's going to keep going.
So I'm curious, Stan, we did some intentional recordings here tonight. We started with the piano, like we had mentioned earlier. We recorded with my setup here, as well as your setup that you're using quite a bit for your archival purpose piano recordings.
Yes.
I'm curious what your thoughts and what you heard with just the differences in how to capture something. What was your thoughts on that?
I was thrilled because the condenser mics that are being recorded on my computer in the other room using Pro Tools did a fine job. Clean, clear, no echo, because the mics behind the piano are trapped between it and the wall. So there are no real exterior reflections, if I can use that. But when we started recording with the 44Cs, playing the same music, I was impressed at how the overall timbre changed more than I was ready for. As you pointed out earlier, with the 44s, because of where they're located, we picked up the whole room, and that was really impressive. Some people may have a preference. I like the variety.
Yeah, and it was nice because what you heard and what we started with was the blend of the 44s and the 88 out in the room.
Yes.
So I could get it more intimate if we want. It gives you the choice. And, what I love about, what I do a lot in my recordings is I have a close source mic, and I mic a lot of rooms, especially in a beautiful room like this. Because one, I want the choice, but two, it's amazing what I can do in the depth domain of blending the direct and the indirect sound, especially with a Blumline microphone like that, that's so well in phase and just really just capturing you could put that mic up. And what amazes me is even out there in the room, you're this close to the piano.
Yes.
But you blend it with the close mics and all of a sudden there's a front to back depth, but there's still a clarity.
To me, that Blumline turns this into the Avalon Ballroom. Is that a phrase with which you are familiar?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
And I love that comment. It's really just, you can close your eyes and that's the aesthetic. It's a mood almost.
Yes. And people don't often think about that there's a lot of ways for when we record sound that we can change the atmosphere, change the dimensions of the room just by microphone placement.
Yeah. It's so often overlooked, just placement and thoughtfulness of the microphone itself.
Yep.
And how much that really does change the sound, right? And I love your comment about, how you can manipulate the mood and the atmosphere of the recording just based on mic placement.
Yep.
Or based on how much of a particular mic you've used. it's amazing. I've done some sessions where I kind of start, even in a multi-tracked environment, I start with the room microphones. It's usually either a Blumline mic or a spaced pair.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of luck recently actually with a spaced pair of ribbon mics, but with the nulls faced towards the source. So it's a very kind of diffuse yet somehow clear sound. And
Yes,
if it's a good room, it's still you can really pinpoint in the stereo image where things are. And it's interesting, when I start with that kind of room pickup, or, okay, this is the best spot in the room to record, right? And that's my anchor, I can then bring in those close mics and create, a mood in a certain feel. But man, if I take those room mics out, the record falls apart. It's almost like, what do I even do now?
What happened? Yeah, some people might say, what happened? The walls fell down?
Well, it's almost, for me, it's like the idea of all of a sudden what sounded like music and like being with an ensemble, even if it's not, you hear ensemble used a lot with classical music, but gosh, jazz, blues, Americana, folk. It's almost like the music kind of takes a back seat for a moment, because now I'm listening to a recording instead of the music. For me, the room mics are so integral in allowing the music to speak, because we're used to that. We're used to interacting with the room.
Yes, if we're watching a movie or listening to a favorite album, we don't want to think about the technology.
Yeah.
And when something like that comes along, it interrupts the flow.
I always think of our ears as just a stereo pair of Omni mics at all times.
Okay. Why not?
We're hearing everything at all times, whether we like it or not.
Yep.
Stan, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story in Clark piano. We did some recording with this today, but let's hear a little bit of the story behind this piano.
Happy to do so. This was built 103 years ago in Chicago. It's a story in Clark. It has a pneumatic mechanism inside that if you will open that panel there.
Yeah, please.
There is one of the paper rolls that produces the information, or data, if you wish, to play the music. Now, friends of mine have gotten into discussions with me about whether this is analog or digital. It is binaural. There is either a hole or the absence of a hole. But I don't really care, because I love the music it makes.
Yeah.
That perforated paper roll and its holes are what produce the music. Behind the paper roll, there's a brass bar. You can see the shiny streak across the center of it horizontally. And there are 88 holes in that tracking bar. And when Ryan or I pump the pedals, that we'll do here in a moment, that causes air to be evacuated from inside the mechanism so that a suction or vacuum is produced and causes air to rush through the holes in the paper, through the holes in the tracking bar, and that's what produces the actual music.
Yeah.
Are you in the mood to pump this thing right now?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, it's already locked and loaded.
Okay.
All right, let's see if I can do this at an angle here. I saw you change something there.
Yes.
Tell me something. I want to know what you did.
Okay. We keep this closed when the grandkids are around. They don't know that there are controls under here, because if they do, they'll mess with them.
Amazing.
So that stays up. It doesn't have to. It works just as well when it's down, but it hides the controls.
So what are these controls?
Oh, the one on the right,
Yeah.
that is the rewind play lever.
Okay, yeah.
When it's pushed to the left, the mechanism pulls the roll down and it plays. When you move that lever to the right, you can do so if you want.
This one here?
No, the other one.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, push that, and that is in the rewind mode. And now if you pump the pedals,
Yeah, let's see.
the paper goes in reverse and rewinds.
All right.
Yeah, and that's, of course, necessary.
Thought I was going to play in reverse for a minute there.
Stop. Yeah.
Yeah.
It could tear that if you kept
sorry about
doing
that.
That's
Yeah.
all right. You stopped. So that's the beginning of the roll, and it
Yeah.
hooks onto the lower cylinder there, and that pulls
Oh,
it
yeah,
down.
yeah.
And that's how you control the play or rewind function, because you have to rewind these just as we did with the audio cassettes back in the 60s and 70s. So the levers, or rather the scales below, you heard and saw me change the tempo while you were playing there.
Yeah.
With the left-hand lever, if you want to move that again and watch up here, you can see that your other left.
This
There,
lever
that
here.
one. You can see
yeah.
that pointer move, and that's in beats per minute.
Right.
And in the middle is 70 beats. And then the other lever to your right is the one that switches between forward and, yeah. Now if you leave it there, it will pull it down, as long as it lines itself up.
Let's see.
Yes, it did. Okay, and it will start playing again.
1 and a 2 and a something and a something.
There's the holes.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful.
Yes. And the right-hand scale there is the transposer.
Amazing.
If you move that, the tracker bar moves back and forth accordingly horizontally, so it moves the reference point between the holes and the tracker bar holes to a different key, and those are in half-step intervals.
Amazing.
So if Aunt Maud is over and wants to sing God Bless America, and it's written or punched in the key of C, and
Yeah.
she'd rather have it in B flat, then we can just move that a couple of notches, and up or down it goes. So
Amazing.
yes.
Stan, it's just an absolute pleasure, as always, getting to sit down with you, getting to talk, getting to hear some great music, getting to record some great music. So thanks so much for sitting down and talking with me.
The pleasure is mine.
All right. Thanks.
We'll have to do this again sometime.
For sure. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.